Good afternoon. Philosopher Kierkegaard pointed out that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Well, looking back and looking ahead are both commitments of the National Commercial Bank. For this reason, the NCB brings you a program for the next hour entitled Conversing with History. It's an intimate conversation with one of the people who contributed. And perhaps no one is better suited to making this presentation possible than the National Commercial Bank, since its own contribution has been significant to shaping and directing Trinidad and Tobago, and its own history has been a series of milestones marking the way along the road to development. The National Commercial Bank is about a lot more than just banking, seeing the world of business and finance as being, in fact, the world of man dealing with his fellow man through the systems of trade and exchange he has evolved. For the NCB, money adds up, but people count. And so it is, in order to play a part in assisting us to live a better life, the National Commercial Bank invites you to join in Conversing with History. Today, our guest is a man who has received the Hummingbird Medal Gold in the first awards ever of national honors. He's been made an honorary fellow of the Research Institute for the Study of Man in New York, a Fulbright Travel Award, an honorary member of the Field Naturalists Club, the Chase Manhattan Bank Folk Cultural Award of 1970. Our guest today is Mr. Andrew Carr.
Well, I'm a bit of a mixture, perhaps the typical kind of West Indian, where several streams, racial streams flow in their veins. On my father's side, the old man, my grandfather, was an Englishman, almost a border Scot. On my mother's side, they were Africans. My grandmother was born here in 1844. We seem to have owned lands. We did. My parents, my African side of the parents, owned lands at Belmont, which are in our possession until the present time. And it's very interesting to see the old deeds. One of the old deeds told about King David. Why they call him King David, I do not know. But it's way back. But we're Africans on my African descent on my mother's side, and English descent on my father's side. But there again, when my father came into the picture, there was a combination of Martinican and a little Carib together with English. So I think I am a sort of melange between English, Martinican, Carib, and African.
Well, I'd like to get to the personality of your mother and father. What were they like, and how did they influence you directly?
Oh, well, my mother was an extraordinary woman, but my grandmother was even more extraordinary. She was a great disciplinarian. And although she never spared the rod, I loved her tremendously. She was always just in what she did. And she was an extraordinary person. She was a great herbalist. She knew all about herbs. And where we lived, night or day, anybody in trouble would send for Mom Behamy. His name was Behamy. And there's a lane in Belmont named after the maternal side of my family called Behamy Lane, just as another one on my paternal side called Carr Place and Carr Street and so on. Well, my grandmother was the outstanding personality in my younger days. A most extraordinary woman of great nobility. Spoke patois fluently, read a little bit of French, and in those days they did patois and French. My mother, I always remember, a very charming person. She played the guitar beautifully. My uncle played the guitar too. And she was a happy sort of person. And I remember in my early days at our house where people gathered around Christmas time to sing Cantique de Noël. And my mother played the guitar, my uncle played the guitar, my father played the violin and the mandolin. No, my uncle played the violin, my father played the mandolin. And between us all, there was music. And they were Africans. And I was born in Belmont Valley Road, where there was an African compound not too far from our house, belonging to the Dahomean side of African culture. You know, the two prime cultures we have here would be the Rada coming from Dahomey and the Shango coming from Nigeria or Yoruba country, you see. Well, these are not of the Yoruba type, but these are the Rada. Quite an interesting group.
And what do you remember of your father?
Well, I remember him as a most extraordinary, composed and controlled sort of person. As a matter of fact, I used to look upon him as a philosopher. I have never known him to be angry. He loved books. He would talk to me about literature. He made me like the American authors and so, and literature in general. And I loved talking with him. He always treated me like an adult. I could discuss any question with my father, whether it's God or carnival, whatever the range is, I could talk with my father. And he never made me feel I was a little boy. And I have a great memory, a great regard for my association with him. She shaped me in a different sort of way. I love books afterwards. I love the study. He was a good botanist. He was a planter. I love nature, discussing natural history and so with my father. So I should say the natural history end came from my father and his connections, because on that side of the family, natural history ran, you know.
What did he do for a living?
My father? He was a planter. They had an estate in Caparo. They built the estate from virgin forests, and he used to tell me how in the early days they stayed for weeks on end in a big ajupa in the forest, felling trees, planting cocoa and all this sort of thing, he and his brothers. And he told me, one of the stories I never forget was, he told me there's a tigre, which is a black and yellow snake, a beautiful black and yellow, almost polished sort of thing, 6, 8 feet, used to come every day and climb the central pole in the ajupa and go in the roof, in the carrot roof, hunting for rats. Now, he says, that tigre was our friend because it kept the rats from our stock, food stuffs, from our corn, from our whatever we had to plant, and was a great protector. And the day it ceased to come, it was a tragic moment for them. They thought perhaps some mindless hunter had shot it.
Well, what was Trinidad in let's say, in a typical week? What was Trinidad like for you growing up, maybe around the age of 10, 11, when you're just about crossing into teenagehood? And were you living still in Belmont? And what, your father is a planter way out east. What was a typical week like for you?
Well, a typical week was, of course, going to school from Monday to Friday. And then Saturday, we boys would get together, and maybe 8, 10 of us, and go out from very early into the hills and live off the land, so to speak. Hunt birds, gathered fruit. In those days, you could eat your fill of mangoes without having to buy. I remember even after that day, they used to sell 27 mango there for a cent. So that's it. And we ate fruit, and we went out for the day. You know, boys camping out in the hills. And it was lovely. You ate all sorts of fruits in the hills, and you trapped birds and you roasted birds, and so my Saturday was spent like that. My Sunday was church. Oh, my mother and grandmother and so liked church, and I was a very devoted little church person in my youth. I remember I used to delight in wearing a white suit because it was the emblem of purity and all this other thing. We were very churchy. Well, it didn't do any harm, eh?
What about school at that time? Where were you going to school, and what was it like?
Well, I went to Belmont Boys School under a great schoolmaster called Alexander Brown. I don't think I ever saw him smile. But I do remember him with a bunch of canes, all cut from guava trees, you know, different sizes. Oh, he loved to flog. You had to learn, or by God, something happened with you and the guava canes, you know. He was of that old school. They believe in this sort of discipline. I believe the excesses of those days perhaps led to the control of flogging afterwards. But a bit of flogging never did any harm to a student in those days, provided it was properly administered, you know, and with certain reason. Well, our schoolmaster was a giant of this, and well, he was a great man. He was among the great schoolmasters of his time.
Could we wonder how many times you and the guava canes met?
Oh, countless times. Countless times. And I used to play a lot. Countless.
What sort of reasons would you have to be sent to Mr. Brown to get some flogging?
Well, one of the going late to school was one. Good old Creole trait, you know. And then not doing well enough at class.
Now, you left the Belmont Boys' School. What happened after that?
Well, at Belmont Boys, our schoolmaster thought a few of us were fit enough to join the exhibition class. And I think there must have been about a dozen or so of us at exhibition class. And every Saturday, we studied right through the week, Monday to Friday. But on Saturday mornings, we went to lessons again, to the school, for half a day, taught by he himself this time, the headmaster, Mr. Alexander Brown. So in 1911, in 1913, by 1913 I was 11 years old, and I had passed 6th standard twice, the 7th standard rather, twice, and then we went up, this was a sort of test, and then we went up for the exhibition. All sorts of people, I forget how many hundreds, there were hundreds of us sitting the examination, and I happened to have come fourth. Now I remember that year, a young man called Ram Kalawan Singh came first, Defantala, not Ray Defantala, Sidney Defantala came second, and Aline and Carr tied for third place. And as Aline's name began with an A and mine with a C, they gave him third and gave me fourth. That time there were only 4 places. Today there were only 6,000 odd and so on. But the same grind of today was the same grind of yesteryear of my time. Perhaps even more so, because there were only 4 going from the elementary schools to the secondary schools annually. So I got in there. And I went to St. Mary's College for a year. Must have been 1914. Because 11, yeah, somewhere around there, 914, 915, when I went. And I stayed for a year, but I don't know whether it was the cramming or what before. I didn't seem to have done very well for the first year. And at the end of the first year, however, I thought I was getting on fairly well, you know. Funnily, I liked Greek, and I liked French, and I didn't like history very much. And I liked 1 or 2 things that was taking place there, but I was getting interested in my studies. And however, my report at the end of the year maybe was not good enough for an exhibition. Now, you know, in those days, I understand they set us it. I suppose they still do it now. However, at the end of the year, the college authorities wrote home to say that I didn't make the grade sufficiently, and if they wanted me to stay on in the college, I would have to pay half fees. And then there was this panchayat at home, you know. My mother felt disturbed, my father felt incensed, and 1 or 2 friends got into the thing too. And somehow or other I get the feeling they felt it was unfair, and I should be given a chance and all that sort of thing. But this was quite definite, and my father, in a huff, I think it was a mistake. But however, in a huff he decided he wasn't going to pay any fees. He rebelled against it, not paying any fees. So they didn't send me back to school. Well, so don't suppose you could catch up after that, you know. But subsequently, my mother pressed on my father, and so the family panchayat did decide, no, they're not yielding to this thing. Well, afterwards, my mother pressed on my father that the boy's education was important and so on. And they arranged for me to go to secondary, go to a school, a little private school. The school had many boys. And for a few years I was in that, and then I went to commercial lessons because they knew then that I had to fit myself out to work in the commercial field. So I did the commercial subjects.
Well, in the period when you were at St. Mary's College, how did you feel about being there? Did you feel that it had done something for you? And then second, when you were at home for I don't know how long before you went to private school, how did that affect you personally?
Well, I was sorry that it ended like that because, I was beginning to take a lot of interest in school life. There were so many hundreds of boys, different sizes, and I was interested in what all of them were doing. I was in Little Yard, and I used to go over to Big Yard where the big boys were. And I always remember big people, some big boys pitching marbles. Oh, they were terrors at marbles. They're such experts. I used to play marbles myself, but I don't know if they taught them marbles at college. I don't think so. But gosh, they were experts. I mean, they could hit a toe out of a hole at 12, 15 feet away. Yeah, that's pretty good going, And we used to play football in Little Yard and go into the swings on the swings and do your gymnastics and things like that. I liked college life. I liked it. And I made a lot of friends, during the year.
We'd just like to remind our listeners that they're tuned to a National Commercial Bank program entitled Conversing with History, and our guest today is Mr. Andrew Carr.
All right, now you've left school, you've gone to commercial school, now you're looking for your first job. What was that like?
Well, the first job I had was with the late C.T.W. Worrell as a youngster. I think they've just wanted me to take me off from idling at home until I got something to do. And I went as a clerk to C.T.W. Worrell. He had just come out, and I joined the barrister at law, just come out from England, office in Sackville Street, and I got $1 a week. I used to pay my library subscription with the $1 a week, so a shilling a month. I had a little parlor account, and and I seemed to have got on quite well on all this little bit. I gave my mother some money. And then I would say that this was a period where the $1 a week was uncertain. If Mr. Worrell, who was trying to make it on his own, he didn't join any firm of barristers and get some experience, as was sometimes done. But he tried to make it on his own. Brave man. And if there was a brief, I got my $1. But if there was no brief, well, you see, so I call it the days of the uncertain $1 per week. But I had a tremendous admiration for Mr. Worrell. Then while there, I completed my commercial lessons because the commercial lessons in the afternoon and all. I didn't do something during the day. I completed my lessons, and then I worked with a firm. The first job after the commercial lessons was with Charles Lee, Chinese gentleman in Charlotte Street. He had a cocoa store, and I was the cashier. Well, the office manager. Of course, I only had the porter to manage, and any little business to be done. And I was a salesman. I had to see after the packing of the cocoa and the drying of the cocoa and the dancing of the cocoa and all that, And at night, so I'll go down to see the dancing cocoa. The porter would hire 2 or 3 people, and they'll come, and it would be a lovely thing to look on, in the night, by the light of flambeaux, dancing the cocoa. And sort of the bagging of it and all sorts of things, and then selling it. So when cocoa slumped, and that was somewhere around now, it could be about 1919 by that time, There was a big slump in cocoa, bottom drop out of the industry and so on, and people were catching the very devil. My boss, Mr. Lee himself, was in a bit of trouble, 1919, 1920. And I remember when I saw him experiencing so much difficulty to pay me my $5 a week, I applied for a reduction in salary. I don't think there's any story like that. I've never heard any story like that. But I applied for a reduction in salary because I saw the difficulty of the man. I loved him very much. I liked what I was doing. He was a very nice man. And I approached him and asked him if he would mind reducing my salary from $5 a week to $3.50. I wouldn't mind. I even thought that perhaps the $3.50 was a little too much. Could have gone to $3. But however, he said, he thanked me very much, Carr. He thought it was just wonderful. He says, oh my God, that's very sympathetic of you, Carr. So I said, Mr. Lee, when things go back up, we'll go up together and so on. You want to go back on the 5? He says, thank you very much. And he promptly reduced my salary from the following week to $3.50. So at that time, though, I was still paying for lessons. I liked to study. And my tutor was a good friend of the accountant of the Trinidad Building and Loan Association. One day, there was a huge football match in Savannah. Oh, lots of people going to the match. I forget who were playing, but it drew a large crowd. I'm saying this because I was tempted to go to the football match myself and left. It happened to be a lessons day. And then I thought, no, after all, it was the day of my lessons and, and my tutor would be waiting, so I shouldn't do that. Bad for discipline, too. So when I went there, his place was closed. I jumped over the fence. I had to jump over the gallery door open, but he was out. So I sat there doing lessons, and I was doing some algebra problems when up comes the accountant of the Trinidad Bill and Loan, a man called Nagon Pear. And he asked, Mr. Nestor, and I said, no, but I expect him, and he expects me. So he came in. And so, what are you doing, Carr? I said, nobody found out who I was, and I said, I'm Carr, and so on. What are you doing? I said, I'm doing some algebra problems. And he had been to Edinburgh University. He says, oh, many years since I did algebra problems. And he sat with me, and we started to do these problems together. And we spent about an hour and a half there before my tutor came in, and we enjoyed ourselves doing these problems and talking. And this must have gone down with him, And when there was a vacancy for junior clerk at the Building and Loan Association, he found where I was living and came to me and asked me if I'd like to come down for the job. You see, here is something happening. If I had gone to the football match, I would not have met him. And we would not have rapped together, as you call it. Now, having done that, he knew who I was, and so. So when the job was opened at Bill and Loan, he came to look for me. I just thought it was significant. There were one or two things in my life that happened that way. You think something you think is a disappointment where it isn't at all. It works out in your favor. So I went down to the Building and Loan, 1921. I remember it was February of 1921. We were in the height of the carnival season. And I was interviewed and I got the job. And I remember the director interviewing me said, well, Carr, go down to Mr. Agard and report that it's all right, you may turn on. Mr. Agard told me, well, the job is not, there's no vacancy until the end of the month. Really, we want this office filled on from the 1st of March. So you could come back on that day. I said, well, sir, I think I'd rather stay on and work for nothing for the month of February because I would then not be any greenhorn when the 1st of March came along. I know something about it. I'd rather stay. You see, I was in the $350 a month job. This one was offering $5. And I could see prospects of development with the company. And I would have liked to get the job. So I said, look, I better start here. And what am I going back there for? Just go to work there for what is the $350 to sacrifice, you see? It proved to be very good because then the Building and Loan was changing over from an old-fashioned huge ledger system where you had to remember all the folios. The old accountant was like a computer. You remember the numbers of all the folios and everything. And we were changing that to the alphabetical system and the loose lease ledgers. So right away, I fell in a big job of typing and so on. We had issued 3,000 shares at the time. And so I was opening accounts and ledger. And during that time, I found 100 shares missing. I said, Mr. Yard, what's happened to this? Is it a deliberate omission, or this is just an error? He says, my God, it's an error. It's a jump of 100. You see, so easy to jump 100, you see, in giving out the shares numbers. And then, he praised me for using my common sense. I like a youngster to use his common sense. It's excellent, and so it's observation and so on. I thought this is going to be good for me at the end of the month. Well, they were so satisfied with me that they paid me from the 1st of February. I was quite willing to work from the 1st of March. Well, I was then getting $20 a month plus $2 war tax. Because in those days we were still under the influence of the 1914-1918 war. So you get 10% war tax, you see. 10%, yeah. So you get $20, I was getting 22. Well, in 6 months' time, they raised me 5, but took away the war tax, so I was up 3. I was on the road to progress. And in about 2 or 3 6-month periods like that, I got a $5 raise and $5. And joining the Trinidad Building Alone in 1921, I liked the job. I liked bookkeeping. I liked figures. I liked office administration and all that. I eventually grew with the company and worked there for 46 years and rose from the junior clerk right up to the top of the company when I left in 1967. I left as the head of the firm. And one of the things, I think working with the Building and Loan Association shaped my life quite a lot because it was offering service to the community. We dealt with the poorest sort of people. They came with all sorts of problems, and they wanted to buy a home and all sorts of things. And I went into this wholeheartedly, helping people with their problems. I enjoyed it. There are hundreds of people who came afterwards to me. You came from time to time saying, thank you, Mr. Carr. If it hadn't been for you, I would not have had a home. I don't remember this. So sometimes they're up in arrears and they're going to be sold, and I told them what to do. If it hadn't been you, I would have lost my home. I don't remember these things. I do these things in the Trinidad Building Alone. I did all this sort of thing and then forgot them. Yeah, you couldn't carry all that, but I didn't want to carry all that. We stood for service, as any building society should. My chief, Joseph F. Agard, popularly known as Joe Agard, believed in that sort of thing too, you know. And one of the things that at the Building and Loan I must pay credit to is that Agard thought that you lived more of your waking hours in office than at home. And since this was so, it was incumbent of all of us to make the moments at office as happy as possible. So he developed this business of a sort of family feeling in the office, which persists to this day. Agard himself generated it. I carried it on. You know, here and there you'll find a person not sympathetic with this sort of thing. But Agard did it. I carried it on. And then today one of our youngsters, Garth Welch, is carrying on the tradition where you have this family feeling in the office, you know, like a bunch of friends and so on. Excellent sort of atmosphere to work in.
Oh, Mr. Carr, you're working for $22 a month. Let's just go back a bit to that time. What's happening to you socially out in the streets of Port-of-Spain with friends and family and so on?
Well, I had my good share of very happy times. We went to dances. We went to subscription parties. I loved going to the parties and loved dancing. I played carnival. I love entering the stream of life. I went to so-called balls too. The Princess Building in those days had lovely balls, and you know, in those days you had a little program and a little pencil with a tassel at one end and a little cord, and you wrote down the name of the girl you were dancing the sets with waltz, passio, this, that, not calypso, it was waltz, tango, passio, Castellan and all this sort of thing, you know. So I had a very nice, rich youth. I think I had a rich boy days, as I like to say. we really could play in the hills and live off the things in the hills.
Just before we continue, we can remind our listeners that they're tuned to the program Conversing with History, brought to you by the National Commercial Bank, and our guest today is Andrew Carr.
Natural history was the first love, and this satisfied something in me, something that even as a child I would sit in the hills looking at the birds and the bees and the butterflies and things like that on the trees. I'd love this sort of thing, the peace and quiet, and the amazing things you see when you sit quietly and see this life around you. I love that. Then of course I told you the family traditions and so. So in natural history, I joined the Field Naturalists Club. It could have been around 1926, 1928, somewhere there. Joined the Field Naturalists Club as a youngster. And in those days when I joined, the club was about 22 members. And one day we met at the Royal Victoria Institute to wind up the affairs of the club. And that could have been around 1930, somewhere around there. I remember Sir Francis Watts, who was president of the club, was in the chair. Father Graf was there, Mr. Potter, T.I. Potter was there, and a few of us, not many. The former secretary, Percy Rodriguez, was there, and Percy Rodriguez was giving up. And when I heard that the club was going to wind up its affairs, I felt quite sad about it. I knew what was coming, but I had read the journals of the Field Naturalists Club, and they had an illustrious past, these enthusiastic field naturalists, you know. And I remember a letter being read at the meeting from Sir Norman Lamont, who was himself a member of the club and a great lepidopterist. He said, excellent collection of butterflies and moths. And Sir Norman wrote and told the club, says, I understand you are meeting to wind up the affairs of the club today, but I hope you will defer your suicide until you have paid me your long-promised visit to Palmy's estate and see my collection of moths and butterflies and so on. That letter was read. So Norman had asked, defer suicide until. And I got up and a youngster among these fellows, and I remember quite shyly, you know, but anyhow I made the point, making a speech on the illustrious past of the club and saying that history will not forgive us if we wind up the Field Naturalists Club. It had done so much. Where else? If any country deserved a Field Naturalists Club, it was Trinidad and Tobago. It was so rich in fauna and flora. It wasn't fair. Where else could people meet? What forum would they have to talk natural history? And we were so rich in Trinidad. Well, after his persuasive speech, the chairman asked Mr. Carr, would you take on the job as the secretary? I said, yes, sir. So I talked myself into a job. At that time, it was an exclusive little club of 22 members. There were only 2 colored people in it at the time, I remember. One was Sierra Williams, my very good friend, who recently passed away, and who was an excellent member of the club. And the other one was Austin Nolte. So I joined in then. There's 3 of us. But, you know, I saw then that the club was weak. We were not making the sort of stalwarts in natural history that these men were. Old Caracciolo, old Broadway, Urick and these people, and Potter and so on. We were not making that sort of being, and in time the club would die. And there were only 3 of us there. And then Father Graf was there. And this led me right away to school boys and girls. Because after all, Father Graf was well known as a science master at Queen's Royal College. Many people were doing science at Queen's Royal, and indeed at St. Mary's, where Father Graf taught, and at Queen's Royal College. So where do these people go with all this knowledge of science, botany, zoology, and so on? I had friends who knew these subjects. They were not in the Field Naturalists Club. Well, where did they go? And it occurred to me that we should widen the membership. And I proposed shortly after my entry into the Field Naturalists Club. I proposed to the meeting that we should widen the base of our membership, and conditions of entry, and that if a person had a good character, they ought to be all right. And if they had gone and if they had done science at the colleges or anywhere, they ought to qualify. If they were nature lovers, they ought to qualify. And so we could have a bigger club meaning more people to appreciate this thing. And it was worth telling a lot of people of all the wonderful things we had. Well, after some debate, I must say that my senior members, the old fellows, decided, yes, we should do it. And in 1 year, the membership went from 22 to 141. 1 year of my secretaryship. But I remained for 18 years honorary secretary and treasurer. And during that time, I remember leading a move. The museum had burnt down. The Royal Victoria Institute had burnt down. All the collections went. And I remember proposing to the Field Naturalists Club at a meeting that the Field Naturalists Club should rebuild the collections at the museum. And I remember Ulrich opposing it at first, saying that after all, how can one build a museum without a curator? Which is a solid point. But then I said, if the place is empty, it's a shell, let us get voluntary effort to go as far as we could in the building of the collection, the rebuilding of the collection. Birds, butterflies, everything. Reptiles, everything. Fish and so. Let us go as far as we could, voluntary effort. And then, when we have something to show government, we'll say, well, let us have a curator. Rather than sort of approach the thing to be spoon-fed from the beginning. Say, let us do all we could do and then ask for a curator. Well, the club eventually decided, yes, let's go ahead. And the club members had a great time trying to rebuild the collections of the Royal Victoria Institute Museum, and did a very, very creditable job. During that time, there are many things happened. One was the formation of the Zoological Society. At that time, Mr. Rex Brooks was Conservator of Forest and Chief Game Warden, and he called me into his office one day and said, Carr, government is thinking of putting up a zoo in the Botanic Gardens. Would the Field Naturalists Club assist in that? I said, yes, sir, certainly. Without even asking. I could now promise you 100% support. However, I will take it to the club. And I did take it to the club, and we did give 100% support. So when we went back with a lot of ideas, I was secretary of the committee doing the ideas. Rudolph Weekin was the chairman at that time. I think Rudolph was by that time president of the club, I believe, or first vice president, and C.L. Williams was second vice president. Or Rudolph Wilkin was president and C.L. Williams first vice president. So we started to work on this. And you know, the secretary, everything falls in the secretary. So it became so happened that maybe 80, 85, 90% of the work to found the Zoological Society rested with me. May I say at this point here that the Field Naturalists Club was started in 1891 and is still going strong. And I think this is an excellent credit to the society. And not only a credit to the society, but a credit to the rich natural history of Trinidad and Tobago. You see, the point I was making at that time is well carried as what is happening here. So I had to be the secretary, and of course as the secretary I had to do lots of things. And we did, I selected the committee, the working committee myself, for what their different callings in life were, what their jobs were, what their special expertise, along expertise. We had engineers, we had a good architect, we had natural history people, we had all sorts of people on that committee, selected for the contribution they could make to the zoo. And I remember C.L. telling me, well, Andrew, we don't know anything about a zoo. What could we tell government? And I said, well, if we don't consider this subject and do something about it, who else can? The Trinidad Naturalists Club. So that what we don't know about in our own knowledge, we could write about. And I proceeded to write in London Zoological Society and write to the New York Zoological Society. I think Mr. Potter was still president, because I remember him telling me, when we wrote to the New York Zoological Society, they said $50,000. And Mr. Potter said that he had written to Sir Julian Huxley, who was attached to the London Zoological Society and the London Zoo and all that. And Huxley had advised it will cost about £10,000. So you see, the money was about the same.
Now, we've looked now almost totally at the Andrew Carr Field Naturalist. Could we look at Andrew Carr, the folklorist?
You know, somehow, when I think back on my involvement in culture, I go back to the days of folklore. In my area where I lived, folklore was rife. Everybody talked about folklore. I mean, those are the days where you believed, quite lively belief, in Sukuyan, Lajables, Lougarou, and the stories were all around you, you know. People you knew. My own grandfather. And I myself heard some strange howls and things like that. And when I go, well, that's a Lougarou, you know. And so on. I myself, one night, chased one down in one of the by lanes of Belmont to see if I could see it. I never did. I only heard a chain. I never saw what it was. I myself saw Sukuyans twice, or what is said to be that, a ball of light traveling in the sky, you know, diminishing and expanding, quite leisurely, diminishing and expanding and so on. So I grew up with this thing live around me. And the first thing of folklore, what was in the folklore thing, was these legends. I didn't take them as legends. I took them as very serious because, I mean, you know, I didn't poo-poo the idea. They were believed by people. They were giving stories, very sincere, very strong, very realistic as personal experiences, and I didn't poo-poo these things. I don't like to despise things I do not understand or do not believe. I don't think that's fair. Let's investigate it. And this is how I began, quite as a young man. Short pants. I was in short pants when I saw my first Sukuyan. There was another thing, too, that impelled my interest in folklore, is that from a child, I was going to the African ceremonies in Belmont Valley Road and in Bell Road and one or two other places with my grandmother and my mother. Although they were not, I should say, devotees in the sense that they danced or anything like that. They were highly respected in the community. We were of African descent. We went to see the African ceremony. And it was most interesting for me. In those days, the old people spoke the African language. I since got to know that it probably is Ewe. But they spoke fluently. And they cracked jokes and they, you know, they told stories. They had conversations.
What is Ewe?
Ewe is one of the languages belonging to the Dahomean people. It could be Fon or it could be Ewe. But I think that where these people came from, the coastal region of Dahomey, Ewe was the language. E-W-E, Ewe. So that I heard this. This was a live thing. And, you know, I always respected what they were doing. I didn't understand. It was something new. I was a good Roman Catholic. And here we all were good Roman Catholics. But this is one side of us. The other side was the tribal side that went to see this thing. And I always respected what they were doing. The old people respected what they were doing. And I did too. And I made up my mind that I shouldn't let myself die without writing about it. I saw that this was an important facet of our cultural life, which I could see even then, you know, as a young man, will move away because people were being educated in the Western way. People were being ashamed to be seen there. People were even more ashamed to be seen possessed. I could see these changes would take place. And I told myself, I promised myself I would not let myself die without writing this thing.
For those of you who may just have joined us, you're listening to the NCB program Conversing with History, and our guest today is Mr. Andrew Carr.
All right. Now, the aspect of culture that I think that we also have to get from you would be, you had mentioned earlier, you would tell us something about songs, and the calypso music. What was your span with that, and how did that interfere with you, and you interfere with that?
Yes, now, right. So while all this was going on with the folklore and the African, I was always interested in carnival, even as a boy. As a little fellow, I belonged to a group who made their own masks on mud molds, and we were in grotesque sweeping yards for a pound. In those days, a pound was a cent, and you cut a broom in the bush somewhere, a little thing, and sweep 2 or 3 strokes in a yard and say, 1 pound, 1 pound, 1 pound, and we'll give you a pound. And you could make up 12 cents or something like that during the morning, and that was a lot of money for carnival, because you could get so many things for a cent. Then again, I used to go to the tents, but not as often as I liked, because my parents, they didn't want me at all to go to see any damn marine. They don't do that at all. And they didn't like us going to tents. Carnival tents, calypso tents. Living in Belmont Valley Road, where we did, it was not so easy to get into the town. I did go to 1 or 2 stick fighting tents in my own area, and did have the courage to peep into a Damlorin tent on one Dimanche Gras night. And what I saw shocked me so much that I ran home in a panic. I was that small, And then I did see Myla hit Freddie Mongo in his head with a stick one night, and the little hat he had in his head jumped about, say, 18 inches off his head, followed by a little spurt of blood. And that too shook me, and I ran home. So I'll tell you how small I was when I was showing some curiosity in those things. I didn't go to as many calypso tents as I had wanted, but during the course of my youth, I did know Lord Executor and Attila, and went to hear them, Radio, Lion. I knew those more than I knew the others. And of course, I knew Tiger.
All of this took you into some of the formal areas, such as the Trinidad Art Society, the Little Carib Theatre. Would you give us how you got involved with them?
Yes, well, I remember Beryl reading to me a letter, and I think it came from Catherine Dunham. And I think as I recall it, we met under a street lamp in Bellow Road when Beryl read this letter from Catherine Dunham. I think it was Catherine. And because I met Catherine Dunham too subsequently, and stimulated Beryl to do something about it. And I was one of the founders of the Little Carib with Beryl. And so was the Little Carib. And then I helped to found the Trinidad Art Society. And I remember we just met in a drawing room someplace. I remember Mrs. Bedell's house. I remember Siblatic was there, and so on, Mrs. Pashley, and so on. A little group. And we formed the Trinidad Art Society. And this was anything like 30 years ago. I don't remember the date now. But we formed the society, and I was the first treasurer. I was foundation member treasurer, always was on the management committee, and I became a president of the society.
Well, we've seen Mr. Andrew Carr, the field naturalist, Mr. Andrew Carr, the folk culturalist, Mr. Andrew Carr, the zoologist, and now the administrator in the art world. But there's a key point to Andrew Carr that started developing along the way at some particular point. Andrew Carr, who was a founder member of the People's National Movement, who was concerned politically, and that's unusual for somebody who has so many other things going at the same time. How and where did this happen?
Well, it happened in 1955, and my eldest son had just graduated from a scholarship he had with the then Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture. And I said, well, let's go he is finished, and I was on holiday, let's go for a stroll. And I used to go frequently up Chancellor Road for walks and so on. I loved walking in the older days. In my younger days, I should say. Maracas Bay from town, Shodo from town, and all sorts of things. Round the Saddle and all this sort of thing. And I told him, let's go up there. And that morning, I knew that Dr. Williams was working with a little group of people, trying, politically. That is to say, it was a little group interested in a political movement of some kind, studying politics and so. And he was beginning to give lectures. He was giving lectures, public lectures, and I had been to a few of them. And so I rang him, and we were friends for a long time back. And I rang him and says, look, I'm taking a walk up Chancellor Road. Are you busy? If you're not very busy, I'd like to drop in and just say hello. So he hesitated for a while, and then he says, all right, would you drop in? I knew the hesitation was that he was preparing for a lecture then, coming in about 2 days' time at Woodford Square, and this was Constitution Reform. So he was preparing it. And he himself told me afterwards, Andrew, I nearly told not this morning, but then I said, well, all right, let him come. So I popped in there for a little while, and he says, you've been to my lectures? I say, yes. You coming this one? I said, yes, and no, it's Constitution Reform. It's published, and I'm going to be there. She said, have you seen what I'm going to put up? I looked at him. When I saw what he was going to put up for Constitution Reform, I liked it. The result was that out of my 6 weeks holiday at the time, I spent 4 weeks in Woodford Square in charge of Constitution Reform, opening my office inside the bandstand every morning at 8 o'clock and leaving there something like 6 o'clock in the afternoon for 4 weeks out of my 6 weeks holiday. I was then the accountant, Trinidad Billing and Loan Association, and some people thought I was rather brave to be doing a thing like that, And when Dr. Williams was going to the country, I was in charge of putting up the packages, and while he was making the speech on the stage, I was handling the background work by candlelight or by electricity all over the country. Volunteers would put tables up, they would bring candles. I had a stock of pencils, and it was an amazing exercise. It was a wonderful experience. And I became the public relations officer of the party from 1956 to 1969.
How do you feel about the role you played so many years ago now in terms of what we now have as our government, as what we now have as a ruling party? You still satisfied with what you set in motion then?
Yes, I am. I find a lot to criticize. Sometimes I wonder, how are we going to bring about the changes that I would like to see happen? Maybe the first thing is to overthrow the government and bring in a new government to try and see if they could use a broom to sweep the stage clean, and then we start all over again. I don't know. But you see, here you're dealing with human nature. You see, in all this, you could have the best. I believe that the PNM has the best constitution in the world on paper. I believe it has the best democratic structure on paper. And then you want human beings to work that.
What of the Trinidadian do you think may be getting in the way occasionally, and how do you see us sweeping it aside and making use of the institutions that you've been into?
Well, that's a long, involved question. But I think one of the greatest things that's happening in the country is the cultural togetherness that's taking place. As a matter of fact, you come to think of it, although I worked hard for 46 years at the Bill and Loan, it seemed that the most important thing in life was the cultural stream. The bread and butter was all right. This gave me sustenance to work at the field of culture. Summing up my life, I would say, bread and butter is not everything. That for me, life must have an inner meaning, something much more substantial than working for food, for sustenance and so, or for prestigious things. I find it in service to the community to the best of my ability in the fields of art and culture and natural history, and even, politics too, and in lots of ways, without seeking any reward whatsoever.
How does the family of a wife, 4 boys and 1 girl survive the ups and downs kind of activity of Andrew Carr?
I must hand it to my wife. I think she's tremendously tolerant. The children have been a source of great pleasure to me. I love them very much, and I think they like me a lot.
What do you say, Andrew Carr, to people who think of you as a kind of oddity who's thrown away all the values, the real values of the world, and sacrificed himself for things that seem to escape and only belong in books and academic studies and so on?
One or two have told me, Andrew, you could have had money, You could have had a car. One of the things I never had. I don't think I will ever have again. Oh, yes, I have 5 little cars and a lot of sub-cars coming up in grands. But, and I have an old house there, which is a lovely antique. I like it very much. And I don't think much of the people who, although people say, but Andrew, you could have been rich, You could have had this, you could have had that. They always say, but maybe you have found the real philosophy of life after all, Only recently one of my friends told me that. He's well-to-do. He has a lovely home. And so on. And he says, maybe you found the secret of life. Maybe I have. I am happy.
Mr. Andrew Carr, it has been a pleasure and a privilege having you on our program Conversing with History. On behalf of our listeners, people everywhere who may not have heard it today but whose lives we're sure you've touched in some way, on behalf of our sponsors, the National Commercial Bank, we'd like to thank you. Thank you for doing what the NCB wants to achieve most of all, working towards living a better life. This has been a National Commercial Bank public service presentation, a production of All Media Projects Limited.